I work on communicating issues around climate change, clean energy, energy transition, clean air, and which is why I will talk for the next 10 minutes about some perspectives on how this issue is getting covered. You might feel that a lot of discussion is also placed in the rubric of climate, but we can try and separate out the climate portion as well as we go along, but at least let's start. This is how we see when we get in touch with some of you here, the media colleagues who are present. We ask you to write about climate change. We also ask you to write about land degradation. We ask you sometimes to say to check if you could file on the power sector, clean air, energy transition. All in all, the way we see it is pretty much in this box that nothing is really isolated. Things are interconnected from the way we see it, and my intention is to also present that interconnection to you, because sometimes what happens is that there is a lot of coverage on the Chennai floods or on the Uttarakhand floods, but there is no connection to climate. Likewise, there is a lot of coverage on how the renewable targets are looking, but there is no connection to the NDCs or the nationally determined contributions. So I think just as we write these news reports, it's also important to keep the big picture in mind, and wherever possible see where there are links, not force them or really make them happen, but really try and look at where those links are to make the story more comprehensive, especially from the point of view of those actively reporting on these issues. I pulled out some slides, and these are just to get an idea of how you all have reported on these issues. They are not our own. They are by a media tracking agency called Meltwater, as you can see. But in the last year, which is 2018, this is the power sector in terms of what issues got covered. So you see the big peak is definitely on solar energy. Most news reports and stories, and this includes both traditional as well as online and digital. So most of the news reports and the impressions were largely on solar, followed closely by wind, but then also by things like rural electrification, agriculture, coal power, etc. These are the things that draw attention. These are the things that journalists like to talk about, and perhaps these are also the things that the editors would like to pick when you have a story, because in the end that is also important of what editors eventually choose in terms of what's being filed. A breakdown of the same share of voice between English and Hindi and Tamil shows almost the same things, but also I guess slightly different. As you see in Tamil Nadu, a lot of discussion on the power tariff, which is not surprising to you all, because that is what you all have been discussing most of all, but this just puts things into some other kind of perspective as well. But nationally, if you see in terms of how English media is writing about it, again the share of voice is pretty much what you saw in the first slide, which is a lot of discussion on solar followed by wind and coal power, in terms of covering energy per se. Nothing different, just another way to represent, but these are the issues that have been front and center of the power sector debate, both in Tamil Nadu but across the country also, but I guess more in Tamil Nadu also, when you talk of things like free power, agriculture, power tariffs, and so forth, and of course solar, because and wind, because as a state which has had one of the largest wind assets much before the Jawaharlal Nehru mission came into force, and the whole thrust on the 175 gigawatts and all of that, I think is more like a legacy issue which has been discussed as well, and which is why you see wind and solar as big parts of what is being discussed in the Tamil Nadu power sector. We also try to do some analysis of the sentiment, just keeping track of how opinion pieces get written, how are experts, analysts, commentators, but also news reports looking at the overall subject of coal, solar, wind, etc. And what you see on the left is a very general sentiment across the country for coal, which means that nearly 70% news reports are really neutral. You have about 23% of news reports which are negative, and 9% of news reports which are positive towards coal. But on the other hand, in the solar and wind as well, you see there is 25% of sentiment which is more or less positive, and largely neutral. I think what this really conveys is that most of the news reports are filed on a very fact and objective based, which is how it should be, because also this analysis has some of the opinion pieces there. Therefore, you see the big chunks on negative coal and the small negative on solar and wind. Well, it doesn't convey more than the fact that it's important really also to see how the sentiment for solar and wind keeps increasing. If that is the direction in which our national energy policy is going, if that is the commitment we've made both on the international fora as well as in terms of domestic target setting, we are sort of cancelling coal installations over the last 6 to 8 years, then really the sentiment towards solar and wind should be more positive as you go along. Well, pulled out some data for Tamil Nadu as well, and not just for the entire country, where you can see what it shows, that it's pretty much a positive solar and wind sentiment in 14% of the total stories filed in that sector, while you have largely again neutral sentiment on coal and some negative sentiment also prevailing over there. Just for us to get an idea of how there has been a rise in these stories getting covered, and not just in the state but also across the country again. Definitely, I think it's pretty evident that the last 5 or 6 years there is increased coverage of not just the climate issues but also of specifically state level issues regarding renewable energy. And this is what is a comparison between 2 years. This is 2015 on the top and 2018 at the bottom, and there is reportage on wind and solar, which you see as the bar graphs over there. I mean, the peak in the peak media exposure, for example, in 2015 was 6,000 stories by volume in a particular month towards the end of 2015. But you already see, for example, in 2018, the peak is going to 8,000 stories by volume. Well, no way to assess anything, but the fact that there is a quantitative increase in the amount of coverage and therefore also in the interest that is there on covering this sector. But that, I guess, is a no-brainer, simply because there is so much thrust both nationally as well as such an alive conversation at the state level, that journalists like yourself are bound to cover this issue. This again is pretty much the same thing, but sorry if this graph is confusing. Only if you can focus on the yellow bars. I wanted to show the yellow bars here, which is the coverage on climate. I mean, pretty evident that in November and December of 2015 there is massive coverage which is over and above any other month, which is like 15,000 news reports per volume, but which again is also the signing of the Paris Agreement, India being quite an important, having an important seat at the table, fourth largest emitter, all of that. So that also is evident of how, there is a spike suddenly, but then things drop. But this, what you see last year, is also pointing to the fact that the base load coverage on climate has increased as well. If you saw a similar graph from 5 years before, which I don't have, you would see the volume of coverage is somewhere around 6,000, 5,000, 2,000, 3,000 stories. But here you see the volume of coverage is 10, 8, 9,000, 7,000. I mean, again, I'm not trying to point out to numbers as a game here, but it's important in some kind of an understanding. And what reminds me is a very interesting Yale University study which analyzed how public perception on climate issues is shaped in India. And the study had some very interesting findings. It found out that when the questions were posed, 8% of the Indian population understood what climate change was. And this was across the spectrum. This was people from cities, also rural areas, peri-urban areas, and so forth. So technically, 8% of the people, according to that Yale study, understood what is climate change and what is happening, which is pretty low. So then the questions were posed in another way, and people were explained what are the impacts of climate change to your livelihood, to your job, to your health, to your agriculture, etc. Almost 83 or 84% of Indians said that they know what climate change is. So I think the point is that it's really not about the jargon of knowing what climate change is as a phrase, but also to be able to understand what the impacts are. And to my mind, that also is important in storytelling, because while people like a very sophisticated, for lack of a better word, an American or a Western audience who will understand the meaning of the word climate change, I think the impacts here are far more deeply felt, and therefore the way the stories have to be told has also to be matched in terms of how the public or the social setup is able to absorb climate as a phenomena, and not when it looks completely disconnected with what is happening to their situation on ground and what is being understood of climate as a very technical or a policy subject, which of course it is not. Uh, okay to skip over, but this is just an analysis from January to September this year, already showing that there are spikes of uh, coverage, the yellow bars that you see highlighted between June, July, August, clearly because of the unusual monsoon that we've had. Most parts of the country have been flooded, rains which are quite incessant, in some parts very high volume of rains and then erratic. So there was a greater link to climate, and I guess that is the only thing that I'm trying to point out here. Uh, Interestingly, I mean, this has again got nothing to do with the state or the power sector situation here per se, but I was trying to analyze which were the two top stories across the country which got shared most on social media, and these two stories came up. In a way, I guess it's important. The top one is really about government announcing household electrification and the fact that there is a lot of gap that still remains. Households still remain dark. The first story was when I think the government had announced 100% village electrification, and therefore said that the country is now electrified. And now the second target that we missed was 100% household electrification. But even within that, and I think that is a good story to carry even right now, because load shedding, power cuts in the most urban areas leave aside what's happening in the rural areas. So that incidentally was the story which got maximum shares on social media. And the second story that got the shares was this whole thing of, you know, and I think this also speaks to where people get interested. All the things that we've been discussing since morning, of solar policies, of how rooftop uptake is slow, how you need to include high tension consumers, how institutions, academics, educational setups are the ones which will install solar rooftop, and that is where the uptake will come from, pretty much sort of dovetails into this fact that when the Delhi government announced that they are going to put solar across 200 schools in Delhi, that is when the discussion became most mainstreamed. And I guess that is the point here, that all these regulatory and policy issues need to be broken down into the socio-cultural fabric, or however you say it, for not just the media but also for the reader to get interested and have attention, and only then the story goes viral, or only then there is interest in things that get covered. While from Chennai, and I was just looking, uh, no comparison between states, but I guess there can be a comparison as well, especially when there is a race to the top. And today, Gujarat government reports that from now on, they will not be giving any permits to thermal power plants. Of course, they've also had their fingers burnt with the Mundra ultra mega power projects and the expensive thermal power. Gujarat also has been quite a progressive state in terms of managing its discom financial health, several other issues. But the message that comes out, the symbolism of it is large and also is important, and these are the things that create that kind of an impression that the state is taking the renewable target seriously. It has committed to have the installed capacity in future coming only through renewables, mainly solar, not through thermal capacity, which itself is good news. But on the other hand, whatever the reasons will be, and the experts in the room know better, again we are at a point where TANGEDCO's financial health, the fact that it does not have domestic coal, is going to import more coal, is also going to commission 1 or 2 units of thermal power plant more, are all things which are perhaps in the value chain of things getting fixed in the future. But as of now, it seems like if you compare state to state, there is more that could be done from Tamil Nadu itself. I will not talk about more here, but I just put these things up because they were being discussed since morning. And I just wanted to stress on my point on interconnectedness, on how, especially when we are filing stories, how do we look at story angles? How do we make sure that what's happening on ground also makes a link to what is being discussed nationally as well as internationally? Of course, the the big 175,000 megawatt target. I think there are lots of ways to parse that target in terms of what each state is doing. When news comes out that Tangetco is no longer going to auction solar, but SECI, will come into the picture from far, and especially when you don't know the sector, it seems like something is wrong and something is not right, which is going on, which is why you have another body coming in the picture, and therefore that is how the solar auctions will happen. But I think these are all things to say that there are angles which happen internationally, especially when we have a prime minister who is quite attuned to the climate and the energy transition message. He has been at international fora, talked about a few things. This morning, actually, at a land degradation and preventing desertification COP, which is going on in Delhi, he talked about how India will stop single-use plastic and has encouraged other countries to do so. So he keeps looking at these fora, but I think what is important is to bring down those conversations to the level of what is happening at the state. Recent statements that were made at the G7 were pretty much by next year, India will make its plan to have net zero by 2050. Now, that is a big target. If India as a country is going to transition to have net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which was the statement which was made in the joint, the bilateral between India and France, there are lots of things that can come out of there on what does it hold at the level of the states, and it is not just Tamil Nadu. What does it, how this will get translated at the level of the states? Clearly, these are big projects. There is no idea. I think even the government will commission lots of studies and long-term modeling to be able to derive 2050 net zero targets. But these are long conversations that need to start somewhere, and I guess the time is now. Energy transition, I will not talk more. Maybe others will, but in people who are reporting on the power sector, there is this lot of conversation on how integration with the grid needs to happen, how the flexibility is important, and how if you have to ramp up input from renewables, then there has to be a way to figure out how flexibilization happens with coal, balancing with renewables, etc. These things do get technical, but then I think there is a scope and a remit for coverage on these issues. At least working in the sector, I'm seeing there is more. But I think the idea is that as we talk about energy transition, there will be more and more discussion on that. Maybe I will skip over the others, but there was a discussion on electric vehicles already. Possibly, is there no scope for a discussion on battery storage, things that can happen at the state level? Well, open questions again. Maybe in the interest of time, I will skip this as well, but highlight just one thing over there as to why did I even put it there. It has got nothing to do with the power sector. This is a slide which talks about how success was achieved in the air pollution campaign. And just a good example to show that when a few stakeholders across the spectrum come together, then change is possible. When the judiciary became active, when the media became very active, when citizens also created a demand for clean air, there is an absolute recognition of the fact. It could be a problem that recognition is mainly in Delhi and some of the neighboring cities, but I guess for a country like ours, even that is not a message to miss, because in the last 3 years of the campaign in Delhi, there has been quite a creation of that window of opportunity when a good campaign happens. And I guess pretty much a lesson more for campaigners than for media, that really for us to explore that window of opportunity where we can create the case for what we want to create, whether it is a solar policy, whether it is no new coal, whether it is more storage, or whether it's better transport, mobility, and therefore electric vehicles. It is possible to do it. It takes a bit of time and planning, but like the air pollution campaign has shown, which actually does also show that no real efforts have been made by the government. Maybe due to some other factors, the air in Delhi has become cleaner, but clearly the point is that a lot of focus has been made on the issue, which has made it really hard to ignore. So it is that peak where things really become hard to ignore from there on. Perhaps that peak is on climate as well. That peak has really been on air pollution in Delhi, and a matter of time where that peak also gets attained on other issues. For example, maybe the solar policy issue in Tamil Nadu when things start getting on track on a corrective stage. Uh, well, this is just to uh, sorry, I didn't want to plug what we do, but this is a website and completely dedicated to issues around climate, clean energy, and clean air. And especially, I wanted to put it up for those who are from media who can write and report here. I will pause. I wanted to show a 2-minute film, again completely unrelated, but I don't have the link right now. Maybe we can play it later. We had done this as a contribution to groups on the situation in Ennore, which talks about not just air but also water and fly ash issues. Maybe in the end, when there is time, then we can show it. Thanks.